In closed deliberation rooms, in political backrooms clouded by partisanship, the fate of billions has been decided. We say it's time to bring that into the democratic public, it's time to bring that into the light. 3 arguments in this speech. Before that, just a bit of framing here. So, given that this is democratic states, we're probably not talking about like overturning democracy or any of this. This is going to be policies that affect a lot of people, so things like abortion, infrastructure, any of that stuff would be like an important ruling. But also, even if they want to argue on opposition that there will be like cases against the government, I think probably given you have a lot of different political parties in most of these systems and they have different incentives, it's insufficient for them to say, well, the case is against the government and therefore the government can't decide it, insofar as the different parties within the government have very different understandings of what that result should be and are able to deliberate amongst themselves as to, again, what they think should happen. So the first thing we'll forward then is that you get a very positive change to how contests within the legal and judicial system function. Clarification, yeah?
Would the decision by the government set the same type of precedent as if it had been decided by a Supreme Court?
It sets a legal precedent, but obviously you can have like overturning that later by other democratic governments. There can be contestation between different like sittings of these governments. So the first thing is how this changes the way that the legal and judicial systems interact. So right now, if courts try and ban something or declare something unconstitutional, the same political incentives to do that thing still apply, right? You still have like governments that want to pass laws that are unconstitutional. They still want to do things like ban certain rights that people have. The problem in opposition world is that, one, they often try and undermine courts' authorities in order to do this. So to get around the judicial precedent, they just say this court had no authority to declare this, or they try and cast doubt on whether or not the court is like even a fair actor at all, a la Donald Trump. But also, secondly, they will just directly disobey, which is to say the fact that the court doesn't have like a military or police force that can go in and enforce its will means that states and regions can just say, we're not going to do this thing if we don't like it. This is why like Oklahoma is currently refusing to give back half of its state to native control, even though the Supreme Court literally ruled that they had to do that. But third, they attack the broader principles, which is to say, with things like Citizens United, they declared that corporations are people, or they contest like whether or not any of this stuff applies. Insofar as they literally just need to contest like the very basics of the legal system. They can't just contest like one case. It has to be an overarching thing. The changes to this process that happen are a few things. So one, if you do this instead of like contesting that stuff often just by disobeying, you have to do it in the actual like Senate or Congress of your country, which means one, you have to have an actual debate about this. Yeah, so A, there's likely to be a certain amount of openness here. You like to have media attention, publicity around this, but also B, you have to justify what you're doing, because instead of just refusing to obey the court's decision, you have to explain positively why you're going to make a certain law. But also, like C, you have to have some kind of legal basis to this, insofar as you're arguing with the court in terms of like the reasoning of your decision, rather than just saying you're an illegitimate actor overall. This means you're likely to use things like the dissents that were written by justices for, rather than just saying we're not going to listen. The second thing here is that you have less broad undermining of the court. So you don't have to attack them as an actor insofar as you just have to attack one case, and you have a mechanism by which you can say, like, this one case was wrong, we're going to get around this. But also, like, third, it has to be 51%. You have to have an actual democratic justification for this. You can't just have, like, states that say we're not going to obey, or, like, we're going to, just, like, ignore the court wholesale, and rather have to listen to the people given that they elected them. The impact of this is, I think, three pretty obvious things. So just one, you have to you avoid undermining the decisions that occur outside of this. So if you have a more broad attack on the court as a way of getting around the court, then you also undermine like other smaller decisions. So decisions that the court makes on like how your tax law works, decisions the court makes on like whether or not you have to provide certain basic resources to your citizens. These things are in jeopardy. You attack the court more broadly, they are secured in our world. But the second thing is that you prevent a lot of the secrecy that occurs around these decisions, which is to say, when you have to do this in public, there's a democratic checking mechanism. Insofar as you have media around this, insofar as you have more people debating, insofar as you have more parties involved, and you have a way to like, also, if people try and do this secretly, explain, you have a mechanism to do it in public, therefore, there's no justification for this, and it looks much more politically shady when people try and do it secretly. Anything from that guy?
So your solution to courts being undermined is to undermine them further by ensuring that any decision can be overturned by a constitutional majority. How does this make any sense?
Yeah, because if you're undermining it in both worlds, it's better to do that in a really public setting rather than having it done secretly or in a less legally based way, which is the entire first argument here. So the second argument then is just that you lead to less politicization of the courts. Insofar as if you know as politicians that like when the court makes a ruling, if it's something really politically important, so something like abortion or campaign finance law, you can deal with that in the legislature. You also don't need to, first of all, have as many radical justices on the courts, because you know that the issues that they will be deciding that you won't be dealing with in the legislature are much more apolitical things, which also, secondarily, means that you prioritize things like competence much more, insofar as you're not afraid of whether or not like a competent person might vote for the other side, because you know on those issues you're still secure, and so you can prioritize just like good judicial reasoning. The second thing is that it's less politically salient as a campaign issue, because you're not deciding things like abortion law or affirmative action there, and you decide them in the legislature instead, means that you also don't politicize the court as much, insofar as there are fewer pressures from the public to do that. The impact of this is depoliticizing the court, at least marginally, and I think this is meaningfully important insofar as A, like having good judicial reasoning is key to just like making decisions that hold up over time, that are consistent and not like constantly overturned, and also in areas that are less political, having like some kind of checking mechanism here. The third thing that we'll tell you is just that this is principally legitimate. Insofar as you often, when you have just the court deciding this and no legislative check, also are ruled by things that are arbitrarily and capriciously made by other governments, which is to say, these people are on the court for an enormous amount of time. Even if you have term limits, you usually have like 40 to 50 years of these people in office, which means there are publics that have things like their very basic rights, things like abortion, things like which college they can go to, that are decided by people who their representatives do not elect, and who they have zero mechanism of controlling, which is undemocratic and also just like morally wrong, insofar as the like basic way the state is legitimate is that you have some mechanism over them. So they can do certain things to you, but you can also have your representatives vote on those policies as a mechanism of accountability. Without that, there is no power that the state can exercise here that is legitimate, and people are being essentially ruled by judicial fiat administration on the opposition side. Very proud of those.
I'd like to invite the speaker for a final speech, and now I'd like to invite the other.
I think one thing that can never be forgotten in this debate is the fact that every time the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of rights for people, and it has involved overturning legislation created by a majority, which means necessarily, to the extent that a majority created this in the first place, a majority will be likely to overturn them and you never have this done. Three pieces of recognition before my arguments. The first is that we probably think the Supreme Courts have some degree of power. I don't think we can completely undermine the legislature, because to the extent this is possible, the debate is a wash, and just literally giving them power, so then we need to do this in the first place. The second is that courts are not actually secret entities.
I've paused the time at 36 seconds. I think you just need to be slightly away from the microphone.
Yeah, okay.
I think if you just like talk without the mic, it might actually
No. Just push the mic maybe away from you. Like to the side.
Yeah, so like rotate it. Try staying a couple seconds out. Because it's been before the minute, I will allow you to restart.
Okay, I can do this.
Yeah.
Maybe like test the
Yeah, can we just get a quick test first?
Round one, so simple as well.
Is that better for people?
Can you guys hear them? Can you guys
It's pretty audible from here because the speakers are pointing. So can we like move there?
Yeah, I know it is.
Can you put the microphone on the other side?
I'm not sure if this will make that much of a difference.
Yeah, that's much better.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so just, no, it's fine, technology, what can I say?
Yeah.
So whenever you're ready, like I said, start from the top.
Yeah. Every single time a court has overturned legislation in order to grant extensive rights to people, things like access to gay marriage, anti-discrimination laws, it has always involved overturning the majority of the legislature that created the laws that courts are overturning in the first place. 3 pieces of refutation before my case. The first is that we assume the courts have some degree of power that will not be undermined in this debate, because to the extent that the legislature is capable of undermining their power, we literally just give them a mechanism to do that in government. If they can already do it, we do it just and watch. The second is to note that courts are not these secret, shadowy entities, as Bev says, but rather that arguments that are heard in the courts are public, that argumentation for why courts made decisions are publicized and often extremely thorough and technical and available to everyone. So I just don't think this is a comparatively true. And the final thing is that to the extent that they're worried about courts becoming political, the alternative is that all of the reasons we care about these decisions being political in nature are not just give it to the legislature, and literally all of these decisions are made in a directly political way in the legislature. This argument makes no sense. 2 broad measures. The first is like courts are reliable in making choices, and the second is that legislators being unreliable. Okay, so why do courts rely on, why are courts good? So firstly on the nature of the documents that they rely on. Constitutions often are created at the inception of a country and require buy-in from a large number of states in order to unify a country and put them together. Be that all of the states in the U.S. signing on to a collective set of laws, or any other situation, a post-colonial state requiring buy-in from lots of different principalities in order to unify. What this means is that in order to get this buy-in, we need universal principles that are broadly agreed upon and generally good. So things like individual rights that are going to protect minorities that wouldn't be willing to sign on to join in with other countries where they will become minority if they're worried about their rights being overturned. This is why across the entire world, constitutions tend to be more progressive and grant more rights than would be popular by the general population, which is generally a good thing for people. The fact that states often vary with that. The second is just to say that the judges themselves often have very strong incentives. They're more resistant to things like populism and bribery because they need constant money to run political elections and campaigns and are generally financially well off. The fact that they are appointed for life and don't have very good elections means they can look into the future. How are they going to be perceived in 100 years by people? If they're taking away rights from people versus not, they care very strongly about their legacy. And I think this also means things are long-term. Just in terms of intuition comes from this fact. Often you'll see courts ruling against the people that appointed them. So Trump appointing, overturning the Muslim ban, for example. But also the fact that courts are unanimous in many countries, in Canada, with almost always unanimous, illustrates the extent to which courts are not super strongly tied to the people that elect them, but rather overall arbitrary principles. So I think the technocratic benefits they bring are also very important. The fact that courts will do things that follow precedent, which legislators do not feel beholden to when we go against popular will, means you get internal consistency. I think to the extent that people are worried that underlying legal principles, like how contracts are interpreted, or whether or not they have, for example, access to certain types of rights, makes things less stable, makes companies less willing to do business or invest in a country where things are volatile and shifting power and overturning, especially when legislation to apply, for example, makes things less stable. I also think that, like, for example, this is why these things often outpace popular will. So gay marriage being granted in South Africa, India, and the United States, when these principles were all broadly unpopular, illustrates the ways in which the fact that courts have holding these documents and have non-political incentives to grant rights. But the final thing is just to note that they have the ability to give checks and balances. So firstly, they are limited to some extent. Like, they don't want to completely have a degree of overreach that undercuts their legitimacy in the eyes of the public, because these things enable politicians to undermine the court and get away with it with democratic backlash, because people broadly value the principles of democracy and courts in turn. So this is why that was not going to be insane. But also, the purpose of limiting power, like I said, is a simple majority. So I think, like, bringing up an example of abortion in the United States, it's kind of funny because the court overturning the previous ruling on abortion just brings back to like zero, as if the courts had never existed in the first place. The comparative then is when the Roe v. Wade never been passed in the first place, which is probably worse. So at least that's probably better. Why are legislatures unreliable? I think they're often majoritarian at best, which means that to the extent that they enable 51% of the population to override their 49. But in the worst case, they often don't get huge problems like gerrymandering, bribery, or outright coups. They mean that they're not even susceptible to that many people. I think that they often you have things like short-term power grabs where government is elected and then does things to immediately increase their power. So changing electoral rules, limiting access to ballots to a lot of people. And these are places where courts often step in and make a difference. So you have things like courts overturning, even Republican courts, overturning Republican electoral maps in the United States by going back to the founding documents that outline the way democracy is supposed to function. Again, because they're like all the examples of how you're supposed to like follow laws, for example, which means that they're often pivotal in overturning coups. It looks like courts in Peru overturning the prime minister's desire to like dissolve parliament and take away people's democratic rights. It looks like this is precisely why countries like South Africa have a different court to prevent corruption and government capture, which means that to the extent that you value democracy as a principle, the fact that courts are capable of overturning and preventing these types of coups by ruling against them means that you increase the likelihood that democracy persists into the future. I'll take point back.
Who is it easier for the public to take recourse against for a bad decision? The government who they elect or the judges they've probably never heard of?
Yeah, I just don't think we actually want the public to have a large degree of recourse, because when a lot of very, very big decisions are passed, things like granting gay marriage rights, for example, these are unpopular. Right? A lot of countries are extremely willing, because they have a majoritarian population that's super racist or bigoted in other ways, for example, to take away rights to an insane degree. The entire purpose then of having freedom of speech, freedom of anything, literally in the Constitution, is the premise that these could be taken away by a legislature at some point. We can't rely on the will of the majority to enforce them. I already gave some mechanisms why courts are not likely to be insane. They have obligations to rely on legal precedent, for example, insurance ability, all the stuff about popularity and cost of law, and stuff like that. I think you also get the prevention of government corruption by enforcing the rule of law. So this looks like even in relatively progressive countries, this can be relatively effective. So in Hong Kong, after the national security law was passed, one of the ways that courts were able to limit the degree to which it was able to oppress people was by doing things like overturning the government trying to limit who can be appointed as a defense attorney for people that were charged under the law. So the government was trying to essentially force people to have a government tie people that would not provide a reasonable defense. But because courts were beholden to legal norms and laws, they overturned those decisions and enabled people to have a fair defense. I think that all of these things mean that courts are substantially better at ensuring that democracy and the freedoms that are built into our constitutions are preserved in the long run, which is massive benefits to the quality of life of people under the status quo in countries all across the world. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to do this.
I'd like to thank the speaker for the final speech. I'd now like to invite the DPM.
I agree. His name is Chalk the Capybara, because I know she was alive. And I'm just gonna sing a level, right?
Yeah, we can do it, right?
Shit. I do this before every final outline speech, but I think it's one of the more important ones. It's kind of great being here. It's probably one of my last speeches, if ever, because I'm going to go find a job and I'm going to go make money and cry. But nonetheless, sharing the stage with some people who've just made possible, people like me to date, on off the bench, people like John, who I've looked up to my entire life, Jacob, who terrorized me in a good and bad way, but taught me what it means just to be honest. People like Anika and Zarina, who, I don't know, were one of these people from a different circuit to look at me, not like I was a nobody, which I was very clearly. That's something important. I've sadly not met Ali Heron, who heard so many great things. I just think that sometimes things like being able to come back and be a person and being able to afford this and the privilege of wanting to have that is something we all forget about until we don't have it anymore. And so to that, I don't know where I'll end up. Honestly, Eli's told me he's lost working government 3 times in the PDO, so I would really well for my life at the point, but whether it ends up being, I think my parents and everybody else is having the ability to allow proud women to take the stage and allow proud women to be heard, and I can't wait to see how many awesome people will be after me. And it could be just something awesome. Hot shit. How did I do that? Without being The pandemic taught something really important, and that is our massive fear of no control. And when you believe that you have no ability to guarantee your own rights, that you are left in the hands of 8 to 12 people who rarely ever look like you or believe like you are continuously in a state of despair. What Eli tells you is very clear, that though opening opposition is correct principally, that this is the way the court should work, the reality is shown otherwise. You have seen a court unchecked and unliked, but more importantly, powerful without any cause above it. Let's just walk through opening opposition. I'm going to give you the best responses that I can, try not to strawman anything of it, but leaving us in a quite good space. Opening opposition posits two important things. One upon reliability, and two upon legislatively. Noting reliability, they extend a few arguments here. A, that judges are likely to be apolitical because of perception and others for secondary reasons, and that they've made decisions that people who look like them or vote them in have disagreed with. A few problems here. One, I think that most decisions that are likely to overturn are usually meaningless or very little meaningful decisions. That was English. Follow the order. It's likely not large reasons for three areas. One, when executive powers actually elect goes into a new position, it is likely they put forward people that they know will posit and believe in their own values. That's why Amy Floyd Barrett and other individuals in the Supreme Court were elected. You're looking for people who are likely to vote in relation. While there might be disagreements on a few decisions, Brett Kavanaugh overturning some IP law that no one really cares about, it's important that the issues that the direct people care about, things like abortion access, religion access, are politicized and discussed. That's why Senate hearings and everybody else discusses those issues quite heavily. Where does this leave you? I think it leaves you in opening opposition, dependent upon the court's benevolence. But the failure here is why they actually do so. Given the fact that they themselves say courts are able to perceptually deliver a message that most human beings don't want to go to law school, don't understand, this checking mechanism is really poor. What is Eli Kelly's response? He notes to you that most of the checking mechanism, the ability to put someone on the Supreme Court, is unilaterally decided by the executive. That on balance, if you're in the US, with dog shit, electoral decision, pull out of a hat or lock, and other spaces of failed representation, means that you really can't do anything else unless being stopped by the president or whoever is in charge. This is significantly worse. This is kind of what CGPOI hints at Eli's impact as to why it is net better if somebody else do so. I think the second part where OO goes at it is saying, well, you have an incentive to care about legacies. You don't need the person who is against this. I actually think that you only care about your legacy for those who agree with you, which is why you're okay being radicalized insofar as you made a decision to uphold being very valuable or not. We are going to always remember the 9 justices that passed Dobbs v. Jackson because of some integral, or the people who delivered the case for Brown v. Board of Education. It is likely your legacy represented on both sides, and I don't really know exactly why it is being political to do so. But even if not that, and you say, well, courts have an incentive to be as good as possible, and this is okay. I think what's even more important about it is this time scale. I don't care how good a person you are, the ability to get on court to make a decision in the future takes years to decades, and in that time, loss of life will continuously happen. You continue to have people losing life on a daily basis on access to abortion. Or you have states taking a decision and swinging entirely left or right, swinging entirely left or right, requiring courts to once again mediate that. Examples of insert South state here, passing a really bad abortion ban, that being existing for 10 days or 10 weeks or whatever it is, and then being struck down by another court whatsoever. If you buy nothing else, when benevolency happens, I think that time scale is significantly worse. It also means that for those people who cannot afford to pitch a fucking suit because it costs a lot of money, or find a lawyer, you have no other recourse measure other than hoping and praying that somebody else will do it for you, versus the ability for you to actually congregate and get other cases. I swear with you. Let's go to the last part of this, right? If not that, it's like, well, overturning just brings you to square zero. So where does this lead you? This actually isn't correct. Because what Eli tells you is that you don't overturn a legislative decision, you overturn a principle. So with Dobbs v. Jackson, you were overturning the principle of privacy, or that existed in the Constitution. The problem is that overturning meant other decisions based on that also coupled with it. You had a question about where interracial marriage was. You had a question about where everything else existed. Like precedents stack upon each other. So overturning it leaves a lot of other rights in jeopardy, but above that, I think gives you more power than you had before that, which is significantly worse. Which means that when courts make legislative decisions, it's probably giving them the right to also decide about things that weren't in that. Like Dobbs v. Jackson wasn't about interracial marriage, but the decisions made were able to influence that unknowingly as well. Why is it better when the legislature does it? I just feel like tells you a few reasons why. One, literally is just on the perception of the court. Insofar as giving opposition cares about reliability, I think it's probably better for them because people don't see the court being weak, and or states aren't allowed to step over them when the court decision isn't valuable. But I think above that, because of why these other ways of trying to reach that power are really sneaky. They don't have anybody else to vote for. It looks like slightly changing donation laws such that you could be heard over everybody else. This diminishes any value of the court, but I think it's significantly worse. A few more reasons for why I don't lower the power of the court, but before that, I'll take Sia. Oh,
The comparative is not having a right to privacy ever, and at best, having it oscillate back and forth with different government
this is
reforms.
a really intriguing part where they're like, oh, courts pass policies that people don't agree with. I don't know how true this is, right? Like, insofar as they say courts are able to like legislate things like gay marriage that nobody agreed with, in India, everyone agreed with, like people wanted this to a significant extent. I don't know what political level we put here, but if not that, like if you say, okay, people like so many decisions that are against the positive will of people, and like 51% of the majority of both legislative states hold on to it, as much as you and I might think this is a positive good thing, it's not like that's not the reason as to what like courts don't appear to be like, alright, moralistic values of those important things. I'll explain that in 5 more seconds. Let's talk about like why it's okay to lower the power of the courts. 5 reasons why. I mean, I think Eli gets really heavily about electability and accountability, where he tells you that the unilateral checks of like the executive, or the lateral checks from the executive, or the only one being able to put this in, is significantly worse. In this, he also notes that when the court's decisions are publicized and they can be overturned, they're required to explain to people significantly better. This is good. You as an individual should know what laws you have to abide by and what it means to do so, which is just like principle right number 1 for you to be a good citizen. Second thing he tells you is the idea of a court being able, or the dissent of a court being valuable in a new way. Insofar as the legislation is like trying to find other ways to instigate their will, it is good to do so within the understanding of what is constitutional and what isn't, versus trying to skirt their way around it, and or putting on long-term figures that are radical that screw you over the worst. I would posit, if you care about things like gay marriage, the ability to not actually, make a decision or make modification here led to Republicans and others putting significantly long-term radicals who fuck you over for long periods of time over and over again. I think this is also significantly worse. Finally, I think if you make like courts stop legislating, notice previously they passed policies, is this okay or now? Now they have the power to like pass abortion is legal or not. This is them overstepping their power because as the constitutionality has gotten more and more complex, they stepped away from worrying about unconstitutionalities as their own principle. That is a little bit worse. We're probably one of the last times. Incredibly proud of those.
I'd like to thank the speaker for a fine speech. I'd now like to invite you to the top part of the dialogue.
Sorry, it's just going to take a minute for me to make sure there's room for the paper. This is a little bit small.
Okay, no problem.
Can everyone hear me?
We could
Can
use
you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, cool.
When the South African Constitutional Court was created, it was a compromise between the newly formed ANC and the apartheid government to make sure that there was a separate constitutional court that could make decisions outside of the reach of elite apartheid influence and lower constitutional courts that were still entrenched in white supremacy. When Hong Kong was transitioned from Britain to China, it was made so that there was foreign judges who could make sure that there was a continuation of the rule of law and common law, which ensured the economic stability of Hong Kong for most of its existence. We think that this debate is not about democracy in an abstract sense. This debate is about ensuring a basic access to human rights, the rule of law, political and economic stability. That is what opening government had to engage with and failed to do so. First, what do we care about in this debate? This is not about whether courts will make individually good or bad decisions. This is about the structural incentives and the natures of these institutions and whether we would prefer to have a check and balance on majority rule or not. What does this mean, right? This means the protection of basic social, economic, and democratic rights, right? This is important because things that opening government talks about. If you do not make sure that you have a check and balance on, say, a coup in which, I don't know, a Peruvian prime minister tries to dissolve parliament unconstitutionally, or you do not have trust in the economic stability of a nation, see Hong Kong, where right now there are development fears because there's more and more ideas that China can overturn the decisions of the Hong Kong Constitutional Court. That is when you do not have access to your livelihood. You do not have access to any democracy. Second of all, even if you were going to weigh on a principle of democracy, we would say that democracy matters more if it is super-majoritarian. Why are constitutions more super-majoritarian? As Jacob tells you, constitutions are developed based on broad majorities, super-majorities, compromises between multiple states, between different ethnic or religious groups, to make sure that you have basic rights that are attributed to more people than the majority, or sometimes minority rule that happens, especially in countries that do not have proportional representation, meaning that if you care about democracy, this is more baseline democratic. CG.
Constitutions that we're talking about in this debate are often incredibly old and archaic and incredibly difficult to change. They don't support the rights of people, instead they restrict them.
So, the development of constitutions is interesting because they know that they're going to be around for a long time, which is why they tend to set baseline rights that can be interpreted and adapted over time. It also means that a lot of countries do have ways to adapt those rulings. For example, in Hong Kong and Canada, they've modified their constitutions informally by interpreting basic principles of minority rights and the rule of law into their constitution going forward. So we would say even when they are old, they are more likely to involve those things than the majority legislature that has no incentive to care about minorities if it is not their primary voting bloc. 2. What is the structure of the court and why is it more likely to be a moderating force that protects basic rights? 1. Jacob already tells you why broader buy-in by states, elites, and international law means that courts are built in a way that is likely to ensure stability. So if you're building a new country where you're trying to adapt your constitution and modify it like you did in Spain, you probably want to make sure that it's something that makes you seem stable on an international level, to make sure that you have more investment, that you have more trade. So there's an incentive to do so. 2, you often have structures that separate influences, right? Which is why judges are very highly paid, so it's harder for them to be corrupt than the average legislature. So even in countries where corruption is rampant, judges are on balance less likely to be corrupt. Thirdly, and this gets into the accountability POI we get from CO, the incentives are better, right? So 1, lifetime appointments mean that it is harder to do things like care about the short-termist views that oftentimes the majority population cares about, right? So legislatures will often vote in reaction to one media bit as opposed to the long-term incentives because they care more about the election happening in 1 year than they do about the long-term sustainability of what they have decided to overturn. Second of all, the justices have an incentive to ensure the legitimacy of the courts. 1, they have a huge reputational one. Note that a lot of judges, either 1, are part of elite classes that mean that they want to seem like they are doing something that is positive in society and that they're not doing something that is radically activist. 2, oftentimes they take jobs afterwards that require legitimacy. So for example, when Beverly McLaughlin's retired, she now does a lot of press conference and writing, which means that she wants to have a reputation for being a fair and neutral judge. 3, it looks good, which is why France switched its constitutional model to make sure that it resembled other countries that had more constitutional legitimacy, because it made the judges look better. Insofar as there is bias, that bias is less likely to be interventionist. Why is that? Because even if you have extremely biased courts like the US, so the US is probably the best argument for that, and it's still not good. I'm not going to take you, sorry. They're probably still likely to be moderating the way they do it because they know that future courts will take the way that they act and use it as legitimate ways to act in similar ways, which is why they tend to send things back to the legislature, like what happened in South Africa. South Africa did not legalize gay marriage in the courts. They told them, you have to modify the wording to be inclusive in the way that we wrote. This also engages with OG's conception that there's a secrecy and a lack of transparency. They published 50 up to 100 page explanations of their case. The reason that you have the idea of a rainbow nation in South Africa is because that's what the courts wrote about when they directed the legislature to legalize gay marriage. So you get that media influence, which is politically stabilizing, but also leads to more economic trust, right? And this gets to the idea about coups. says coups are not important here, right? But we would tell you that coups are actually likely to be thwarted by the legislature. Why is this the case? One, because legislatures often cannot influence, so coups often not influence the courts directly, or else they probably won't get buy-in from international law, which means courts can often either stop coups from happening, or at least lessen the degree to which they are harmful to the average person. Weigh this because it's logically prior to accessing democracy. Lastly, on minority rules. This matters because God has given us no reason to believe that minorities and marginalized rights will ever be protected by majority court, right? We would tell you that this is where the courts matter the most, because they are likely to do things like Canada did, which is say, hey, you cannot ban abortion, but we will send it back to you for your legitimacy to rule exactly how you're going to regulate abortion. This is things that happens by the court because they want the legitimacy of showing that they're following constitutional law and they don't have short-term thoughts that the legislature have. Proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker for a fine speech. I'd now like to invite the MG.
Just want to confirm that I'm audible.
Yeah.
Oh, do I just have to accept that? Is that much better?
Okay, good.
Even if I talk forward. Yeah.
Whenever you're ready.
Opening opposition's cases hinge on progressive change. I'm going to say that three things in this speech that prove why we will. Firstly, why you get less accountability under their side of the house. Secondly, why judges don't have the progressively minded incentives that they kept trying to assert to be true. Thirdly, why you don't get that change and why it's far better to be able to be done and encouraged through other systems than the judicial ones. Firstly, and quickly on accountability. What I want to know is they tell you that they want people not to be able to respond to the growth in rights. They want people not to be able to go out the streets and protest against things like gay rights laws getting through. What they have to accept on the flip side of that is that they prevent people from protesting the removal of gay rights laws or the overturning of those by constitutional courts like we've seen in the Supreme Court. I'm going to explain why it's far more likely they're seeing aspects of regression under their side of the house and why we need to push for more progressive things. Lastly, just briefly here, undemocratic states are out of this thing. We're not talking about China coming in and enforcing horrible things on top of things. We're talking about democracies with political incentives. Right, two things I want to address in this speech. Firstly, talking about why judicial appointments are always far more inherently conservative, don't have a lot of the incentives they talk about to try and increase change. Secondly, I'm going to spend on talking about why that is so, why this change is such a good thing, and why we're able to get more progressive things through as we start to challenge these incentives. Firstly, on why judicial appointments are significantly more conservative. I think that's incredibly important, even to note in societies that are very, very heavily focused on meritocratic judicial appointments. Going to what our OG says about places like the US, these judges still come from the most privileged backgrounds because law degrees are fucking expensive. They still have to go through intensive legal training and have a lot of time, riches, to go through these things. Often because there are bars and barriers to do with racism and sexism, they not people who have to experience those things. Often that means you're supported by things like, aspects like studying money or all those kinds of things. What these people can, to some extent, still be progressive. The fact that they don't have to go through these barriers, the fact that they see this as having gone through all this hard work themselves, the fact that they often come from the elite society, mean they are far more likely to be within groups that have more conservative ideologies within these things. Second thing to note here, often Supreme Courts are quite small, no thank you, in size. Often, you're looking around 7 to 9 in such. That takes out everything that OA tells you about how you can be more representative of dozens of colours or minorities within your group, because you cannot have those people often serving in your courts. It's only incredibly recently with quite a decent population that New Zealand has put the marriage judge on there. Incredibly unlikely to see minorities getting on these things. Even when you see it in the US, Justice Thomas is incredibly conservative, himself. He has to go through those systems in order to gain legitimacy to get on them. Thirdly, in systems where, to address no thinking, also what OA says about legitimacy. They say judges want to have a bunch of legitimacy and be seen really well so they can have careers after it, or that they can be respecting their publications. If you're in a society that is intensely against gay marriage at that point in time, I can guarantee you, acting a way that is actually legitimate is not to support gay marriage. If you want people to publish your papers after, if you want to be respected by the elites of society who are probably against something like that, you're losing legitimacy if you take these social stances. If that's why they want to into the debate at, they're not getting the change that they claim to be about. Last thing here, when we look at how deeply politicized things are, it's important to note that progressives are often the parties that do not play the game, the political games of appointments. That is obviously very important to note how the US judge system has gone, because obviously the Democrats didn't try and stack the court or block Trump from getting those on, but the Republicans did try and block Obama's appointments. That means that you have a very biased Supreme Court. The reason that's incredibly important in this debate is that when Owen tells you judges aren't short-termists and that we can operate in these perfect ways that are outside the wings of what the general public think, they actually very much are, because you can have one instance like that where a more conservative party can block several lines of appointments, where you can have one cycle which for the next 20 years of judicial decisions occurring in that country, despite the potential for massive changes to occur and what people believe in these things. Like in the 1990s in Australia, homosexuality was a crime where I was from. It was overturned because, or it was able to be changed because the will of the people changed on those kinds of things. That's incredibly important to note, that those are the types of things they lock in. Right. Second thing I want to talk about is why it is so good that we're switching away from these things and what some of the problems with legal reasoning are. I think it's really important to note how legal reasoning operates within this and why it isn't very good at being progressive. When we look at how constitutional interpretation works, you're often implying in rights of things that are written centuries beforehand, or in places like the UK where you don't even have something to be interpreting on, ones that are written often by very rich white people, or being imported in or being copied from another country. They do not have the nuances within it to demonstrate certain things. That is emblematic of most places without constitutional democracies protect the right to abortion under privacy. That's not abortion, that doesn't demonstrate that. Often you're trying to really throw these things in. It gives a lot of legitimacy to conservative judges overthrowing it and just say to the general public, oh, well, abortion doesn't fit into the category of privacy. Why would woke leftist judges trying to throw that kind of thing in there? Right. The Constitution also isn't particularly easy to change to update those things. A 50% majority is far easier to put in gay rights into a constitution or reject her thing and getting rid of it than going through a double majority in a lot of different places is. Overturned rights notably do exist because of processes like these. Notably, those kind of actions are going away. But what they miss is that you can see an increase in those rights outside the House. Before I go, I would take over.
So conservative elites often vote in favor of minorities because they're beholden to constitutions that are created for structural reasons we said to support them. Compare this to legislatures, which often face the same elite incentives for requiring money in education and all that stuff.
Look, I think legislators have made immense changes in becoming far more representative as time has gone on. I think the fact that there are still many courts in Western world around the place that have significant portions of POC people entering them, but they do not have a POC person on their court at all, or they have to fit into one political ideology. I don't think that stands within the state. Right. Continuing on to talk about why the bad tool to create rights is inefficient. I think that when you have to hear things like precedents that are obviously just set back in the past to try and argue through how legal rights work, I think when you have to try and use legal reasoning to justify why abortion fits into the category of privacy, when obviously to some extent it's a little bit of a judgment call as to what kind of things you believe as a judge, what kind of legal narratives that you're spinning. Court judgments often are have some degree of bias in them, often what people believe about them. That's why you can find a court judgment that is pro abortion or one that is anti-abortion, and yet still both use legal reasoning to do so. It is why it's far better for these progressive things to then be seen to be legitimated by the government if they do happen. It's because the approval in them not being overturned is a beneficial thing. Because the counterfactual realistically is that if they're going to overturn gay rights, if they can't overturn gay rights, they're going to smear the court system and say that they fail to achieve these things, that they are beholden to some wokeness agenda, that they shouldn't be trusted in the decision they're making. That reduces the trust in them and any other accountability they're able to do, or any other judgments or decisions that are far less controversial. Notably, the change in this debate is that we're putting the social change into the hands of those elected. It's approved by the elected even when it's done by the public. It means you can't see horrible social right reversals occur when you have a majority progressive party in. So you can't see voting rate overturned when you do have a Democratic majority in the lower house. And we think judges have incentives to challenge the normal society rather than being pushed back against them because we think that they're legitimately so proud to oppose.
Okay, I'd like to thank the speaker for the final speech. I'd now like to invite the end.
guys ready? Yeah? Cool. I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to make this simple. I'm going to argue a number of things. 1, why constitutions are generally good. 2, why Supreme Courts are generally good. 3, why Supreme Court judges are generally good. 4, why the democratic system should not determine rights. 5, why democracies are bad and will not lead to the maximization of fulfillment of rights. And 6, if I have time, sorry, if I don't, wait. Firstly, why are constitutions generally good? There are 3 reasons. Note that this is not only more in quantity than opening opposition, but they're going to be better. 1, most of these constitutions were written in the 50s and 60s when the vast formation of new states occurred because of the rise of anti-colonialism and the rise of post-colonial states. This was at the peak of time after World War II, where there was a climate of maximization of human rights protection to try and reverse the harms of World War II and to try and ensure that these things never happen again. 2, the vast majority of these states borrowed from the West, who themselves have strong human rights protection. Intuition, if you think the UK generally has good human rights protection, France, Spain, Italy, the vast majority of countries copy from these countries because they were the colonial overlords. That means that every other country had some kind of good rights and that was in their constitutions. 3, and finally, they've managed to foster, constitutions themselves are good because they've managed to foster and maintain a democratic environment. Insofar as the info slide says that these are democracies, and insofar as I've proven that these constitutions were made a long time ago, I think that on balance, even if we can't maximise the rights of everyone, this is an amazing baseline which has managed to endure the test of time. Why does this matter on a point of weighing? We don't know whether future governments will trend right, trend left, whether they'll be competent or whether they'll be malicious. But we know for a fact that these constitutions are great at preserving the base level of rights that allow democracy to foster. Therefore, if we have to choose on balance which one you prefer the preservation of, it is the strict reading of the Constitution which uniquely comes when Supreme Court judges are judging. Why is this the case? So secondly, why are Supreme Courts generally good? The majority of Supreme Courts aren't quite politicized like the US. I think that most engage in independent, experience-based appointments. So for example, in the UK and Europe, we have independent Supreme Court commissions. In Israel, you're appointed within the legal profession, which is why the Israeli Supreme Court has been anti-Netanyahu despite being in power on and off for the past 15 years. Why is this crucially the mean case? There are 3 reasons. Firstly, there is a general respect for judges and legal professional democracies, and they are generally seen as being impartial. That is why, and this is the intuition, we allow them to adjudicate the law at all levels. So for example, you never see mass disputes of criminal cases. Most people trust the judge system, they trust the appeal system, they trust the court as a source of verification. 2, politicized appointments are very unique to the US checks and balances system, which is why the vast majority of countries have independent systems. Thirdly, again, colonialism was often the basis of the fusion of legal norms, which means that the UK and European independent system is the most common globally. The impact of this is judges are independent and objective in the vast majority of cases, which leads to them being rigid in their interpretation of the Constitution in the way that I've already explained is good. Thirdly, why are Supreme Court judges generally good? We have 3 reasons. Firstly, they spend their life studying the law and have a deep respect for it. In the same way that astrophysicists care about space, or economists hate the misinterpretation or delegitimization of the importance of the economy, we think that they have a deep respect for these things, which means that they want to preserve it and they want to care about the nuances of it. 2, their incentives are reputational based. Now, a lot says that they care about their legacy in 100 years because they're not in a short-term election cycle and have tenure. It's not clear why politicians being in an uncertain environment means they don't care about legacy. I'm going to go further. I think the very socialization of judges makes them beholden to expert judgment. In the same way that debaters care about WUDC PDOs and no normal person understands that, I think that judges go to law school, they go to the bar, they rise up into the legal path. They want to be referenced and supported in texts that they study, and they want academic clout. This is why they use legal and logical mechanisms to explain their points, and this is why they care first and foremost beyond their ideology about the preservation of that constitution and proving that they were the defender of it. Thirdly, how they argue is rigorous in 2 ways. 1, they use precedents which require thought if you want to overturn them, because you have to undermine the logic of those precedents. And 2, legal arguments are logical in nature and start from basic principles of the Constitution, which I've already proven are really good at preserving democracies for decades and decades and decades. The key weighing here is objectivity and fairness, because the best way to resolve competing interests or the allocation of rights is with objectivity and fairness, because the truth searching and being able to move towards the truth makes people feel like they are in a legitimate system, whereas the whims and the emotions of other people do not make people feel legitimized when we're talking about the allocation of their rights. I would prefer that a Supreme Court judge says that X, Y affirmative action policy is good as a black woman than that a random white man tells me that for example, I am in racial slur. Therefore, I am going to vote against your rights. And I think that is important in this debate. OG.
Legislatures overrule on both sides, either publicly on OG or secretly on OP, ignoring, refusing to enforce, legally undermining the USC.
Okay, please, I don't think that you understand how constitutions work. Legislatures can't just undermine what the Supreme Court says. And if they think that that is the case, they have a completely different conception of reality, which they should have spent time framing in open government. Fourthly, why should the democratic system not determine rights? There are a number of reasons. Firstly, the tyranny of majority must not be the most important thing in the debate. But secondly, even if democracy is key, opening government and closing government can't prove that they maximise democracy due to democratic deficits, meaning that rights protection is the most important thing. On the first thing about the tyranny of the majority, I have 4 points. One, just as a thought experiment, you wouldn't let the majority decide who gets to vote and who is not allowed to vote. And the reason why is because voting is an essential tool to defend your interests. Therefore, you can't let majoritarianism decide the allocation of rights, because rights are foundational to pushing for your access and your interests, and you must have the legitimacy and recognition and equity of the state to be heard. That is what rights are, and therefore they can't be decided within the democratic system because they are foundational to it. Secondly, the electorate often want hypocritical allocations of rights, where certain people get less based on immutable characteristics, such as being gay or such as being black. I can't help that I am black, for example. Therefore, it's not clear why that is a sufficient justification for somebody to come into, and why their democratic right to vote on the deprivation of my rights is legitimate. Fourthly, rights are about humanity and agency. Insofar as democracy is a competitive exercise and you're competing against each other, the same majority who denies me the right to, for example, vote or denies me the right to access certain rights cannot be the same majority with whom I am competing in an election when we all go to vote on the ballot box. Fourthly, it doesn't harm you that other people have rights. There is no trade-off, so there is no reason that people should be able to, who are not concerned with that issue, to come to the ballot box and vote on the allocation of my rights. Finally, why can't they maximize democracy on their side? One, personality politics and rhetoric is the easiest point of resistance for the government because it's very easy for them to use rhetoric to control anyone. Two, polarized political systems mean that the parties themselves don't have accountability because if you're a black Democrat, you're always going to vote Democrat, so you're never going to vote on this issue. Three, people vote on a vast variety of things, so that's to trade off the economy and voting on this constitutional amendment. If we maximize rights, we win as a result.
I'd like to thank the speaker for a fine speech, and now I'd like to invite the GDO.
The initial Australian Constitution was one in which it did not recognise Indigenous Australians as citizens of the country and did not count them in the census. When this was finally amended to be repealed, it occurred in 1967 and it was passed with over 90% of the vote. Suggesting it was probably something that large swathes of the population believed was a bad thing decades earlier, and something that could never be changed by legislation from governments, because constitutionally it was always going to be something that was there clear as day and that courts had to uphold. We, on the side, expect greater changes, because constitutions are difficult to alter. They require referendums which are politically unpopular and difficult to pass, and we are the side that allows governments to get these changes earlier, with the will of the people much, much clearer. Okay, two questions I'm going to ask in this speech. Firstly, who are judges, and secondly, what they're judging. Firstly, who are judges? I think opening government does a good job to point out that courts do bad things, but we have a team in this debate that mechanised why judges are overwhelmingly likely to do bad things instead of positive changes in the first place. OO and CEOs, a lot of extent, have some explanation of how judges are generally good. They say they can't be corrupt, they say they're well because they're well paid, they say they care about democracy, and they want to care about objectivity. The first thing I would note in response to this, though, is the notion of objectivity is inherently personal. Judges believe they are doing the objectively best thing for the people, just as legislators do. So it's not really clear why judges have any better understanding of what that is than any other individual in the democracy. But secondly, let me tell you what Harry tells you. The judges are in general the most privileged people in society, particularly in systems that are perhaps less politicized but more meritocratic, like Australia's high court system, right? These are judges that have moved up through the legal system who have not been shackled by the biases that pervade them in the status quo, which means they probably experience these sorts of issues, and that any choice they make is likely to be impacted by the fact that they are relatively privileged. Importantly as well, though, courts in many of these instances are incredibly small. In Australia, there are 7 people on the High Court, in the US, there are 9. Whereas in Parliament, there are 150 people, much more in many other democracies, which means that you have a much lower barrier of entry for people who are otherwise oppressed to be in there and to actually be making that change. That's why there are no people of colour on Australia's High Court and have never have been before. And even though they are fairly unrepresented in Parliament, they at least exist in the first place. The fact that you have Indigenous Australians in Australia's Parliament is a good thing, because it means they would now have a vote on things that concern them, but they do not have in the smaller laws right now. This is incredibly important because even if you don't believe the judges are super aggressive in all instances, in general they're less progressive than the rest of society, or they're more aggressive than their compatriots in the legislature, which is incredibly important because this means that any harm that is going to be occurred here is much more likely to be progressive in the courts and overturned by the legislature than progressive in the courts and overturned there. Also, we just presumably note that a lot of the next about legacy presumably also apply to people in Parliament as well, so it's unclear why these only apply to judges in these instances. I think what that essentially proves to at this point, at least today, is that at the point in time opposition wants to hang their case on judges being good and these benefits, these purveyors of change, they are just systematically not. They are people who are most privileged and do not understand what it means to be someone from a minority background. Even if they sometimes do good things, they do them much later than the rest of society would have them do, and that is why we went here. This of course also applies to instances in which it's much more politicized, right? I think it's obvious in the US that the left has fallen victim to the high road logic of wanting to be moral with its judicial appointments. What we're essentially seeing right now is what Harry tells you. For the next 20 odd years, the Republicans will probably control the Supreme Court, which means that any sort of legislation that they want to knock down from the Democrats, and stuff like gerrymandering, is stuff that cannot be voted against. I think that's likely to happen in the future as well. Obviously, I think this gets overall on the assertions that people are racist or regressive from OO. Because even if people are racist or regressive, judges are even more likely to be racist and regressive. Because these are the people at the top of the society that is racist and regressive. Obviously, the impact of this is incredibly important. Because stuff with shit laws that harm people and oppress minorities, we win on that alone. Secondly, though, what are people judging? I think OO at sometimes in this debate kind of asserts that these are going to be things that are inherently anti-democratic. And I just think that's likely untrue. It's outside of the topic. I think we can just accept that they probably support democracy in some instance. We get a lot of defenses of constitutions for opening opposition and closing opposition. And they say that people generally have rights because they need wide buy-in, or they are recent, or they are based on the West. I think it's important to note that CEO's mechanism of these constitutions are recent but are based on the West is kind of contradictory. Western constitutions are often some of the most oppressive in the first place because they were old and have not been accurately updated in the future. A couple of reasons why these constitutions are actually like that. Firstly, when they tell you stuff in opening opposition about needing wide buy-in from states, that is just state buy-in. It's not buy-in from the majority of the population, which means that if you have countries where you have a minority that is spread across the country, it doesn't mean that you need their buy-in any more than you need, in the status quo, which is why Indigenous Australia was screwed over originally in the Constitution. Secondly, as you kind of point out, in a lot of these instances, constitutions are old, right? The 50s and 60s were still pretty shit times for human rights. Just because you had a proliferation of them in general doesn't mean it is anywhere near close to what we see today. But thirdly, and most importantly, they're incredibly difficult to change. In Australia, to change the constitution, you need a 2/3 majority of the country, and you need the majority of states as well to support it, which means that this is something that the majority of the population could totally believe should not be in the constitution anymore, but it remains in the constitution until the point at which it can be changed, which is obviously incredibly bad. Which means, when they characterize populations as racist, it's unclear how they overturn any of the racist stuff under their side of the house. Importantly, the example that I gave in my introduction stands here, right? The fact that Indigenous Australians were not represented until 90% of people supported it in a referendum change means they were probably meant to be in the constitution decades earlier. It just did not occur because it's politically unpopular to go for referendums that don't pass. I'll impact this in a second, but sorry, I'll keep opening.
Okay. Government misunderstands what courts can do. Courts can rule that legislature violates the Constitution or add additional rights, even when the minority can't influence the legislature because they're too small. But legislatures can still add anti-discrimination rights if you
So in this instance, and one I give, the legislature literally could not say that Indigenous Australians were counted in the census because the Constitution explicitly stated they could not. These are the most harmful things in this debate, right? But constitutions are explicitly racist or ban things like gay marriage, and you need them to be, the only way you can change them is by a referendum. On the outside of the house, governments can do things like ignore the racist or homophobic or sexist aspects of the Constitution and just legislate against it if the majority of the population want it. Obviously, this means you get social change decades earlier because these things are not fully traced to the fact that, these constitutions, perhaps understandably so, are really, really hard to change. So, what is the impact of this? Under our side, you get much quicker social change because the government can do things they were never able to under the opposition side. Secondly, though, you get much more increased engagement with politics because people actually care about voting for socially progressive parties at the the point at which they can make changes that otherwise would not be allowed by the constitutions. They care about that because it's doing things instead of judges. But thirdly, judges increase the legitimacy of their decisions when they don't have to do crazy shit with precedent and connecting things that doesn't seem to make intuitive sense to the average person, because they can just say it outright and they can talk about what the laws are. At the end of this debate, we win because firstly, we are the only team that proved by judges are on net less progressive than the rest of the population. But even if they weren't progressive, the stuff they have to deal with is in the scope and it's something that's old and outdated and is oppressive. So we are so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Speaker for a fine speech. I'd now like to conclude the debate with Odo.
Is this good for everyone? Yeah? Outstanding. Give me 1 sec. This speech is just going to be a simple team-by-team going through why explaining why we beat each one. I will start by weighing our case against open opposition. So the open opposition mechanisms for why courts make good decisions are firstly there was elite bargaining to create these constitutions in the first place, and then secondly judges care about their legacy and reputation in the long term. And I would note that these are obviously good mechanisms and certainly true in some contexts, but I'm not sure if they're true in every single one. So for example, every single person who argues for a revolution might all be members of the elite. But for example, in India, where every single person who was in the Congress party which achieved the revolution there was a member of the elite and had studied in the West and incredibly rich, like Nehru went to Harrow, etc. We show that even if these people are all members of the elite, they still care about rights in that climate, and we're still able to get this. In fact, the very fact they were part of the colonial elite probably means they were educated in the West and means they were educated in an environment where they value these sorts of rights. It probably means they were able to witness things like the basic minimum constitutions that were implemented in the West as well, and so were then able to implement that in their country. We see this explicitly. This is why the Indian constitution is partly based on the one in the US and is therefore far more progressive than the BJP Hindutva chauvinism that exists at the moment. So we are able to show, in the government's absolute best case, we still get the sorts of progressive constitutions we want, and our mechanisms apply more universally on this issue than open oppositions. And similarly, I think on judge reputation, open opposition explained that you care about legacy and your reputation to some extent. And I think that closing government have a good response, which is that, what if the country trends conservative? I think that we are logically quiet, and I hate to use that word, but we are to this case. Because we explain that the specific reputation that you want to value is the reputation that you face in the international legal community. It is the ones of fellow judges around you and so on. But also, crucially, the fact that you've chosen to be a judge in the first place, rather than becoming a super rich corporate lawyer sellout, probably means you value these things incredibly inherently, regardless of any reputation. So again, I think we show, and we're able to complete this argument and actually prove it, because we show that the specific degrees of reputation that you care about are the sorts of things that lead to the changes they want. The last thing that they say similarly on why democracies are likely to be bad, open opposition again have talked about gerrymandering and lobbying. I think this is probably a much more US specific case. I think we show that there are general trends in democracy related to personality politics that make this bad. But also crucially, even in the best case of a fully functioning democracy, that is unlikely to lead to good change. Because for example, you have to only vote for one party, so your preferences are unable to be fully reflected. I know people, for example, who are economically right-wing and socially progressive, but still vote for the right-wing party because they value that thing more. So actually get a more holistic vision of change on our side of the house. So I think therefore we're able to show mechanisms that don't rely on context and are far more universal on every single issue, which is why we're beating open opposition. And the key weighing about why this point is crucial is that when these rights are able to be far more longer lasting, which is what we're able to prove, you're able to have certainty in order to actually effectively live your life and be able to have a good quality of life in the long term in general, and that's the most important thing. So, given that then, I think we're able to provide a better set of mechanisms than open opposition on the same issues, and so we're able to take over them. Secondly, on closing government, they have mechanisms about why Supreme Courts tend to be bad that are threefold. Firstly, they're rich white people and members of the elite. Secondly, but they're small, and I think their best one is that they have long-term holdings and so become out of touch. The first thing, and this is a mechanism that I really hate in debating about rich white elites, just because someone is a rich white elite person, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily conservative. In fact, the very education that they probably received in universities emphasizes this degree of rights from the kind of teachers they've been taught. Like, guys, look at debating. Everyone here is usually pretty fucking privileged, but they're also incredibly left-wing. I don't think this actually makes much sense as a mechanism. It doesn't stack up with what we see happening in the real world. The second mechanism that they have is that they are small, and so that a judge's individual biases matter far more. I would note, first of all, that they can still be incredibly representative, because you can just have a representative set of the population within this 9 people. See, for example, Biden appointing a black woman to the Supreme Court just now. But also, crucially, these judges are trained to be objective. They are trained to put their biases to one side, to judge as the average reasonable voter, but actually the average law interpreter. And so they're able to actually work incredibly effectively to deal with this and put their biases aside. In fact, they've been there for a long time. The best mechanism they have is that these people will become out of touch because they have long-term kind of, they're able to be on Supreme Court for life. Again, I think this is kind of US specific, but even if it's not, I still think that actually the fact Supreme Court, this is not necessarily a bad thing. Why is being in touch a good thing, especially the electorate is likely to become increasingly discriminatory? But also, democracy doesn't necessarily improve this because of the reasons we say about personality politics. The third thing I would note here is that cases which talk about certain themes and rights and so on get brought up all the time, and so you're always presented with chances to reconsider your view and form a nuanced position. But actually, if someone is on the Supreme Court for life, then maybe they're just an incredibly effective judge and we should probably trust them. Maybe they become out of touch, but I don't think they do enough work to show whether being out of touch is bad. But finally, on weighing, I want to just be incredibly charitable to this team and concede the entirety of their case. Maybe, even if you buy everything and actually judge as a conservative and as slow, why is that far better? Now, closing government themselves say there is a path for reform on their side of the house. You can do things like referenda, you can do things like have a supermajority for change. And if this thing is popular, this will obviously happen because there is an electoral incentive for it to occur. But it's actually far better on their side of the house because now, well, before I talk about that,
Arguments with judicial care showcase that people make decisions, but not moral ones. Obviously, the case wise to the Supreme Court, there's a conflict.
I think we've actually improved their moral decisions. So, lastly then, actually this reform is far better because the main thing for rights is certainty. You need to know as a minority that in 5 years, if the election goes slightly wrong on a very fine margin, your rights are going to be removed. You need to have that certainty to be able to actually live your life in the first place. And insofar as a referendum and supermajority is far more likely to last in the long term than a particular majority decision, that's actually far better. So even in their best case, we win. The last thing I want to do briefly is this opening government idea about, secrecy. I just, plausibility check. What does this look like and how does this happen? How can a democracy just come in and, subtly undermine the Supreme Court's decisions? I can't think of a single case in the real world where this has occurred. And I would note that if a Democratic Party is actively trying to undermine the Supreme Court, there are massive incentives for the media to actually look into this and show that this is happening and that it's actually deeply problematic. So, given then that the Supreme Courts have to be public and these things are heard publicly, and the big decisions they make have to have justifications for them that are available, I don't think the secrecy case is in the debate. I think at the end of the day, we just provide a very, very compelling and universal set of mechanisms to win. Proud to